If you were a kid in the 90s and you only had a Super Nintendo, occasionally Genesis did what Nintendo don't. Okay, let's get into this one. When I was a kid, all I had was a Super Nintendo. I did not own a Sega Genesis. I was not fortunate enough to have both. Most people I knew only had one, though. And if you had one console over the other, you always had these games that felt cool on the other system. And so I thought today would be really fun to list my top 5 Sega Genesis games that felt cool. Like, they're the ones for me that I wish that I could have played not owning a Sega Genesis. They're the ones that I wish would have been on the Super Nintendo. Dare I say some of them might be on the Super Nintendo, but they just felt cooler on the Sega Genesis, and some of them just felt built for the Sega Genesis. This is not going to be a detailed thing of what year these games came out and all that. This is just all from memory and why they felt cool to me and why they still feel cool to me. So with that, let's get it started. Okay, coming in at number 5, we have Echo the Dolphin. Echo the Dolphin is such a unique game to me because you're literally controlling a dolphin and a bunch of otherworldly crap's happening, and you just got to navigate through the waters, and you get to jump and dive and do dolphin things. It's kind of cool. And there was just, as a kid, there was nothing on Nintendo quite like this. I can't think of one game on the Super Nintendo that even comes close to the style of this. When I was a kid, I thought the graphics just looked impossible to do on a Super Nintendo. They were so ahead of their time from my little perception of me. Like, I don't know who told me this at the time, but there was always that reputation that it was one of the most graphically sound games on the Sega Genesis. The swimming in the game felt smooth and unique. I remember being a kid and going to like these demo stations at like Kmart and Sears and Walmart. And if they had a Sega Genesis, a lot of times Echo the Dolphin was on there, and that would be the game that I'd want to play. Because a lot of these demo stations, they'd have a couple different games to choose from. And it just always seemed like one that you could fiddle around with at those. And then if you went to a buddy's house, they usually had it. I didn't know until later a lot of people had it because it ended up becoming a clearance game and kind of on the cheap. But as a Super Nintendo kid, it felt like a cool game to have on the Genesis, and one that I wish that Super Nintendo had. I thought it was weird in a good way. I don't necessarily know if it holds up now, but I'm going back to the perception of when I was a kid and it feeling cool. And it definitely felt cool to me. And that's why I had no problem putting Echo the Dolphin as number 5 on my list. So, yeah. All right, so now at number 4, we have Splatterhouse 2. Now, Splatterhouse 2 to me, what an interesting game, because going back to being a kid, being a fan of Freddy and Jason as a kid, you've seen this cover in the stores and you're like, wow, that's Jason on a game. You didn't realize it wasn't Jason. It was just a guy in a hockey mask, but it's hard not to think of a guy in a hockey mask and not think of Jason. So instantly you saw this game and you're like, oh man, Sega has a Jason game. That's cool. It looked very adult. It looked like something that your mom or dad would never even buy or let you have. There was blood and horror elements in it. When you actually ended up playing it, you're fighting aliens and stuff. It seemed way more adult than anything Nintendo had. Like, by far. Just from the cover art, from the back art, from the Jason mask, just the name Splatterhouse 2. Like, just seemed like something that ain't no way Super Nintendo was going to have in their library. It had a lot of rental store appeal, and what I mean by that, with that cover art, you'd be sitting there going to the video game rental store, and of course I'd go over to the Sega Genesis titles and see what they had, and you'd sit there and you'd be almost jealous that it was sitting on that rack. It was one of the first Genesis games that I sought after playing when I ended up owning a Genesis, and it's definitely one, if a buddy had it, I was always like, man, we got to play that. How is that? And you just felt like you were playing something that you shouldn't. The game itself isn't the greatest. It's just kind of a side scroller. You're just hitting aliens, moving along. It can be challenging at times, but again, it didn't matter how it was played. It didn't matter what it was about. What mattered was that it looked dangerous and it made Genesis feel like a grown-up system. And to me, Splatterhouse 2 perfectly represented what the Genesis was trying to be, which was edgier, more adult, and the cool system. So with that, I have no problem putting Splatterhouse 2 at number 4. So yeah, on to the next one. Okay, then, coming in at number 3, we have Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker video game, only on the Genesis system by Sega.
Now, this one's a very interesting title because I always thought as a kid that we got kind of gypped having a Super Nintendo and not having Moonwalker be a game that was on there. This game felt like something that should have been on both systems. And Michael Jackson was the biggest star in the world, and there was kind of a little bit of resentment that I couldn't get that game. Why wasn't it on Nintendo? I still want to know. Like, he must have just signed a deal just for Genesis, but there was always an instant jealousy factor in the rental stores when you went to somebody's house and they had it. Just the fact that you were able to play as Michael Jackson and he was dressed up in the Smooth Criminal outfit and the music was playing in the background and he was kicking like Michael Jackson and the frame rate looked good. So much that made me insanely jealous that this game was on the Sega Genesis. I half already mentioned it, but the soundtrack, of course, because it's Michael Jackson music. I mean, it's instantly recognizable. You instantly know the songs just in MIDI format, what they are. And I haven't really touched on this too much, but one of the biggest things that made the Sega Genesis seem cool as somebody who didn't own one was the black cases and the black cartridges. They would make something like this really pop out and feel like, oh, this is a hot game. Because the label of Michael Jackson's Moonwalker on that black case and on that black cartridge just made it seem really, really big. It looked cool on the shelf. It felt special and different. To this day, it's not the most expensive Genesis game, but man, if you want a complete in-case copy of this, you're gonna be paying over $100, maybe even a couple hundred for a really good copy. It sold like gangbusters when it first came out. I know that. It's not edgy like Splatterhouse and it's not weird like Echo the Dolphin. But the fact that it's that exclusive celebrity game was just so interesting because there was other celebrities who had games. A lot of them were like Shaq Fu and Michael Jordan had Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City. And he had sports stars, but for just one of the biggest pop stars ever to have a game just on one system and one system only still seems so interesting to me. I feel like the Genesis sound chip totally fit the soundtrack too with his music. This is a funny observation, take it as you will, but the whole point of the game revolves around Michael Jackson saving kids. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Hits a little differently now, so... And to close out on this one, because I know I'm just gushing about Michael Jackson and the game and being jealous that it wasn't on the Super Nintendo, I don't think Moonwalker was cool in the same way that Splatterhouse and Echo the Dolphin were. It was cool because Genesis had the biggest pop star in the world all to themselves, and that made you want a Genesis even more. So with that, that's a big reason why I put Moonwalker at number 3 on my list. All right, at number 2, we have Mortal Kombat 2. Now, Mortal Kombat 2 was not a Sega Genesis exclusive. It was available everywhere. It was an arcade game first, of course, and then it was available on Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear. I owned the Super Nintendo version, actually, and I played it all the time. But it didn't matter. I still wanted the Genesis version for a few reasons. I've already touched base on the cool factor of the cartridges in the case. I kind of said something about that on Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, but I'm really hitting it home now. Those cartridges and cases being all black really made something stick out for being more badass on the Genesis. And I think Mortal Kombat 2 is the greatest example I can give. Even though I owned it on the Super Nintendo, it didn't matter. I wanted that Genesis version. It felt more adult. It felt edgier. When I would play the Genesis version at buddies' houses, the controls just felt tighter. The fatalities were easier to execute. Combos felt easier on it. It just had this look like it belonged on the Genesis. There was just an aura to that game on the Sega Genesis that never got matched on the Super Nintendo. The aura was so high that to this day, when I bring up Mortal Kombat 2 to people, they'll be like, yeah, wasn't blood only allowed on the Genesis version and not the Super Nintendo? Well, fun fact, by the time Mortal Kombat 2 came out, they were allowing blood in the Super Nintendo, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter because they messed up with Mortal Kombat 1 on the Super Nintendo and they didn't allow blood. And because of that, Mortal Kombat as a series always felt edgier on the Genesis. And to me, Mortal Kombat 2 feels very, very cool because of that blood controversy. It might actually play better on the Super Nintendo, believe it or not, because I've played both recently and it might look better and play better on the Super Nintendo, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the reputation was there from the get-go that it was better. The schoolyard and playground reputation when I was a kid was that Genesis equals blood and Genesis equals edgy. That instantly means that Mortal Kombat 2 is cooler on the Sega Genesis. And to close out on this, what I gotta say about this is Mortal Kombat 2 isn't higher up on this list than others because it was exclusive. It was number 2 because it perfectly represented what made the Sega Genesis absolutely cool and edgy. And it gave you that feeling that it does what Nintendo don't. So at number 2, Mortal Kombat 2. All right, at number 1, we have Sonic the Hedgehog. Honestly, it doesn't matter. Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles. Sonic as a property made the Genesis cool to me. I'm not going to say there's not a lot to say, but it's kind of hard to not feel like I'm being repetitive of what other people say because it is Sonic the Hedgehog. But what I will say is, as a Super Nintendo owner, that was the one game that every Nintendo kid really, really wanted on the Super Nintendo. They knew they couldn't get it, but they wanted it. You know, Mario was a great game and a great mascot, but with the Mario World game and Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3 on the Super Nintendo, like, they weren't as fast paced. They weren't as cool. There wasn't as much attitude as there was on Sonic. You turn on Sonic the Hedgehog and instantly it just feels different. It feels like a different machine, and it really showed off the console. I remember going into like Kmart's and Sears and Walmart's and having the kiosks. I had already mentioned that before with Echo the Dolphin, but this was always one on there. And I remember just going over and playing the games and just loving them for not having it. And that's where I really got my taste of it outside of people having the game. And I remember if you went to somebody's house and they didn't have a lot of Genesis games, that would be the one that you would lean towards. It just felt so cool because of the speed and the adrenaline rush that it gave you. The music and the soundtrack and the sprites are so good on the game. I mean, what a lasting legacy Sonic has. Sega doesn't even make consoles anymore. It doesn't matter. People hear Sonic the Hedgehog. Kids hear Sonic the Hedgehog. They usually know that it's a Sega property. I think it's the most important Genesis franchise, of course. I think that Sonic had its peak on the Sega Genesis. I don't think it's been matched since. I know that there have been good games that have been on other consoles since, but man, it really was king, and Sonic was really the one that was making the Genesis sell a lot of units. There's not a lot to say as far as why it's number 1. I mean, it's not the best Sega Genesis game in my opinion. It's not the rare Sega Genesis game. You can get Sonic 1, 2, or 3 for less than $20 usually. It's not the most mature game. It's aimed at kids. It was still the one game on the Sega Genesis above all the other games that I have listed that I really, really want. And I knew that I couldn't have. And for that's why I think not only is Sonic the number 1 coolest Genesis game, but it's also the one that made the Genesis cool. So with that, Sonic the Hedgehog at number 1. And with that, we have my top 5 games that made the Sega Genesis feel cool. That I miss that feeling of having a console and being jealous on what the other side had. I think it's a lost thing. Let me know in the comments what some of your coolest Genesis games were if you were only a Super Nintendo player. And also, if you were a Genesis player, let me know what some of the really cool Super Nintendo games were that you wish you would have had. I think this is a pretty subjective list, so I don't really think there's a wrong answer to this one. This is all kind of nostalgia based, and I don't want to say emotional based, but it's based on the fact that I didn't have a Genesis. So let me know what you think, and leave a comment below then. Don't forget to like and subscribe and be on the lookout for other videos.